The Oka Crisis officially ended in September 1990. The barricades were dismantled, the soldiers withdrew, and the Mohawk people of Kanehsatake, who had stood against the full force of the Canadian state for 78 days, began to leave. But what awaited them beyond the military lines was not safety. It was humiliation. As the Mohawk men, women, and children were escorted away from their own land, they encountered crowds of angry civilians lining the roads. These civilians were not soldiers or police officers. They were ordinary Canadian citizens, residents of nearby communities who had been fed months of negative news coverage portraying the Mohawk as violent aggressors. Instead of seeing them as people defending their sacred land, they saw enemies. As the vehicles carrying Mohawk families passed by, the crowds began to throw stones. They hurled rocks, sticks, and bottles at the windows. Glass shattered. Injuries followed. Elders who had gone days without food or sleep were struck by flying debris. Children who had spent weeks living under siege watched their parents and grandparents bleed. Mothers shielded their young ones from the shards as stones smashed into windshields and side windows. The military convoys escorting the Mohawk out did little to intervene. In some cases, soldiers simply stood by and watched. In others, they struggled to hold back the crowds but failed to prevent the violence. For the Mohawk people, this was one of the most painful moments of the entire crisis. They had endured the armed raids, they had survived the siege, they had stood unbroken under the threat of guns and tanks. But this, being attacked by civilians, ordinary people from neighboring towns, revealed a truth that was even harder to accept. The violence was not just in the government, it was in the society itself. The stones thrown at them symbolized the deep, systemic racism that Indigenous peoples have faced and continue to face in Canada. It was not about political conflict anymore. It was not about negotiations or land claims. It was about who was seen as human and who was not. Even after months of suffering, the Mohawk were treated as outsiders, as enemies in their own land. This event, the stoning of Mohawk people as they left, is rarely shown in textbooks or remembered in official accounts. But it should be, because it exposed a brutal truth. The problem was never just about land. It was, and still is, about racism, superiority, and the refusal to see Indigenous people as equals. The Oka Crisis was a battle for land, yes, but it was also a battle for dignity, for humanity, and for the right to exist without being hated for simply standing up. The scars from those stones, physical and emotional, are still carried by the survivors to this day. And that is where the real story begins. What was the Oka Crisis? The Oka Crisis was one of the most significant Indigenous land disputes in Canadian history. It exposed not only the unresolved land grievances of Indigenous peoples, but also the racism, inequality, and systemic failure that had been buried under Canada's polished international image. The crisis took place in the small community of Kanehsatake, located near the town of Oka in Quebec, Canada. It began in March 1990 and escalated into a national confrontation by the summer. At the heart of the dispute was a small patch of land known locally as the Pines, a forested area containing a traditional Mohawk burial ground. For centuries, the Mohawk people had fought to preserve this land from development and encroachment by settlers. Despite repeated legal petitions, protests, and appeals to the Canadian government, their land claims were ignored or dismissed. In 1990, when the town of Oka announced plans to expand a private golf course onto the Pines, including the burial site, the Mohawk people had no more patience for legal battles. They decided to take direct action to defend what little was left of their ancestral land. They built a barricade, a physical barrier to prevent construction crews from entering. It was a peaceful act of resistance, a desperate measure taken after centuries of broken promises and cultural erasure. But the government did not respond with dialogue. Instead, it treated the barricade as a threat to public order. On July 11, 1990, heavily armed officers from the Sûreté du Québec, Quebec Provincial Police, attempted to dismantle the barricade by force. A confrontation erupted, and in the exchange of gunfire, a police officer, Corporal Marcel Lemay, was killed. This incident escalated the situation far beyond a local protest. The Quebec government called in the Canadian military. Thousands of troops surrounded the small Mohawk community of Kanehsatake. Helicopters patrolled the skies. Armored vehicles moved through suburban streets. Snipers were positioned in trees and along roads. The Mohawk people, including elders, women, and children, found themselves besieged by one of the most powerful military forces in the world. The standoff lasted for 78 days. For over 2 months, the world watched as a small Indigenous community stood against the Canadian state. But beyond the barricades and military presence, the Oka Crisis revealed something deeper. It showed that Canada, a country that celebrated itself as a defender of human rights, was willing to use violence to suppress Indigenous claims to their own land. It showed that Indigenous peoples were still treated as second-class citizens, their rights easily sacrificed when they conflicted with the interests of developers, settlers, or governments. The Oka Crisis was not just about one piece of land. It was about the entire structure of Canadian colonialism, the theft of Indigenous lands, the suppression of Indigenous voices, and the ongoing struggle for justice. Even today, decades later, the issues that led to the Oka Crisis remain unresolved. Land claims across Canada are still tied up in courts. Indigenous communities still face systemic racism, and many Canadians still do not know or choose not to know the full story of what happened at Kanehsatake. The Oka Crisis matters because it broke through the silence. It forced a national conversation about Indigenous rights, a conversation that continues today. It exposed the myth that Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples was peaceful and respectful, and it showed that when Indigenous people defend their land and their ancestors, they are still often met with violence, not dialogue. Understanding the Oka Crisis is essential to understanding Canada's true history. It was a warning that ignoring Indigenous rights would no longer happen quietly. It was a stand that shook a nation and demanded the world to see what Indigenous peoples had been saying all along. Historical background, land theft, and ignored claims. To understand the Oka Crisis, it is necessary to understand the deeper historical context, a long, painful history of land theft, broken promises, and ignored Indigenous rights that stretches back centuries. The Mohawk people, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, lived in the region of southern Quebec long before European settlers arrived. Their connection to the land was not based on ownership in the colonial sense, but on stewardship, cultural traditions, and spiritual ties to the environment. When the French colonial authorities arrived in the 17th century, they did not initially claim the Mohawk land outright. Instead, in 1717, the French government granted a portion of land at Kanehsatake to the Catholic Church. The idea was that the church would hold this land in trust for the Mohawk people, ensuring they could continue their way of life. But in reality, the trust was a formality that masked a deeper shift. Over time, control over the land increasingly fell into the hands of colonial and religious authorities. Land was parceled off, sold, and developed. The Mohawk people, who were supposed to be the rightful stewards of Kanehsatake, were gradually dispossessed without compensation or consent. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the Mohawk community filed numerous petitions and legal appeals to both the colonial and later Canadian governments, seeking recognition of their land rights. They cited the original agreements and argued that the lands had been misused and unlawfully taken. Each time, their claims were either ignored, delayed, or dismissed. By the late 1800s, much of the land that had once been reserved for the Mohawk had been lost to settlers. The town of Oka itself grew directly out of this process of dispossession. Farms were built, roads were laid, churches were erected, and the Mohawk were pushed onto smaller and smaller pieces of territory, with little formal legal recognition of their traditional claims. One area, however, remained particularly important to the Mohawk people: the Pines, a patch of old-growth forest that included a burial ground where generations of their ancestors had been laid to rest. For the Mohawk, the Pines was not simply land. It was sacred. It was a physical connection to their past, to their families, and to their culture. They continued to maintain that the Pines was their land, protected by their original agreements and by their continuous presence in the area. But to local and federal authorities, the land was increasingly seen as available for development. In the 20th century, parts of the Pines were already under pressure. In the 1950s and 1960s, the town of Oka built a private golf course nearby, even as Mohawk objections continued. Once again, their concerns were ignored. In the 1970s, the Mohawk filed a formal land claim with the federal government to regain control of the pines and other traditional lands at Kanehsatake. They sought legal recognition and the return of their territory. But like so many Indigenous land claims across Canada, the process moved at a glacial pace. Bureaucratic obstacles, legal technicalities, and a lack of political will ensured that no action was taken. By 1990, the Mohawk people had been waiting for more than 270 years for their land rights to be acknowledged. When the town of Oka announced its plan to expand the golf course into the pines, it was not seen by the Mohawk community as a new insult. It was seen as the final betrayal, a continuation of the same pattern that had been repeated generation after generation. The government had ignored their land claims, the town had dismissed their sacred sites, and the broader society, by its silence, had allowed it to happen. Faced with the imminent destruction of their burial grounds, the Mohawk people realized they could no longer rely on courts, petitions, or promises. They had to act. And so began a resistance that would shake Canada's image at home and around the world. A resistance rooted not in anger, but in survival. The Oka Crisis did not erupt from nowhere. It was the result of centuries of disrespect, dispossession, and the refusal to recognize Indigenous humanity and rights. What happened in 1990 was not simply a protest. It was the boiling point of centuries of injustice. The golf course expansion plan, the breaking point. In 1989, the town of Oka, Quebec, officially approved a plan to expand the private Oka Golf Club. The expansion would add 9 new holes, and to do so, construction would extend directly into the forested area known as the Pines, including land that contained Mohawk burial grounds. The project was treated as routine by local officials. They did not consult the Mohawk community. They did not seek Indigenous consent. They did not recognize the cultural or spiritual significance of the land being targeted. From the perspective of the town council, it was just another business decision, a chance to attract more tourism, generate more revenue, and raise the profile of the area. The sacred nature of the pines was dismissed as irrelevant to their plans. For the Mohawk people of Kanehsatake, however, this was not just another insult. It was a final warning that their history, their culture, and their very identity could be bulldozed without a second thought. The Mohawk community had already fought legal battles over the pines. In the 1970s, they had filed an official land claim seeking the return of the area. But like most Indigenous land claims in Canada, it remained tied up in bureaucratic processes, unresolved and largely ignored. Now, with construction crews preparing to move in, the Mohawk realized that waiting for court decisions or government action was no longer an option. If they did nothing, the graves of their ancestors would be disturbed. Trees that had stood for generations would be cut down. And once the golf course expansion was completed, the link between the Mohawk people and that land would be permanently broken. The issue was not simply environmental, it was existential. Losing the pines meant losing a part of their heritage, a place that connected the living to those who had come before. The Mohawk people had to make a choice: accept the destruction of what little remained of their land, or resist. On March 10, 1990, they made their decision. Community members began constructing a barricade on a dirt road leading into the pines. They placed logs, rocks, and abandoned vehicles across the path. The purpose was simple: stop construction and protect the land. The barricade was staffed by volunteers from the community, not militants or outside activists. These were local Mohawk men and women, elders and youth, united by a shared determination to defend their heritage. They set up tents and watch stations. They organized food and supplies. They prepared to hold the line, even if the authorities came. At first, local officials and media dismissed the barricade as symbolic. Few took it seriously. But as spring turned to summer and the Mohawk refused to leave, tensions began to rise. The town of Oka sought a court injunction to have the barricade removed. The Mohawk refused to comply, citing the illegitimacy of the land seizure and the urgent need to protect their ancestors' graves. As the confrontation dragged on, the provincial government became involved. Pressure mounted to restore order. not by negotiating, but by force. The stage was now set for a confrontation. The expansion of a golf course, an act that for most towns would have been a simple economic project, had become the breaking point for a people who had already lost too much. And what began with a barricade on a forest road would soon turn into a national crisis that forced all of Canada to confront its colonial past and ongoing injustices. The Mohawk people of Kanehsatake were not just fighting for trees or territory. They were fighting for respect, recognition, and the right to exist on their own land, rights they had been denied for generations. The decision to expand a golf course into sacred Mohawk land was not just a business mistake. It was the match that ignited a fire the country could no longer ignore. The Barricades, the Mohawk take a stand. By the spring of 1990, the Mohawk community of Kanehsatake had reached a point where no other options remained. After years of being ignored by courts, dismissed by politicians, and having their land claims delayed indefinitely, they knew that paperwork would not protect the pines. Only direct action would. In March 1990, they set up a barricade. The first barricade was modest, just logs, tires, and a few abandoned vehicles blocking a small dirt access road leading into the pines. But the meaning behind it was massive. It was a declaration. The Mohawk people were no longer willing to watch their land be destroyed. They would defend it. At first, there was no violence, no confrontation. The people behind the barricade were not soldiers. They were community members, mothers, fathers, elders, and youth, standing together to protect what little was left of their heritage. The barricade was organized with careful intention. Watch stations were established. Food, water, and medical supplies were stockpiled. Schedules were drawn up to ensure the barricade was manned at all times. The Mohawk traditional leadership, the Longhouse people, led the movement. Their belief was simple. The land had been entrusted to them by their ancestors. It was not something that could be bargained away, and it certainly was not something that could be replaced. As the weeks passed and spring turned to summer, the barricade grew. Additional defenses were set up. Volunteers from other Mohawk communities, and even some from other Indigenous nations, began to arrive to offer support. Soon, the barricades extended beyond the dirt road into the pines. New roadblocks were set up on nearby highways, including the Mercier Bridge, a major traffic artery connecting Montreal to its southern suburbs. The strategy was clear. If the government and developers continued to ignore Indigenous voices, then Indigenous resistance would make itself impossible to ignore. The presence of the barricades began to frustrate local residents and government officials. Media coverage initially portrayed the Mohawk as troublemakers, refusing to obey lawful authority. There was little focus on the reasons behind the protest: the centuries of ignored land claims, broken promises, and the desecration of sacred sites. Instead, the mainstream narrative painted the situation as a disturbance caused by Indigenous radicals. This growing pressure led the town of Oka to seek a court injunction demanding that the barricades be dismantled. The Mohawk people refused. To them, the courts had already proven themselves unwilling to deliver justice. Following another legal order would only guarantee the loss of the pines forever. The government now had a decision to make: engage in dialogue and negotiation, or escalate the situation by force. They chose force. On July 11, 1990, police officers from the Sûreté de Quebec, SQ, moved in to enforce the court injunction and dismantle the barricades. The decision would transform a peaceful land defense into a full-blown national crisis, one that would reveal how far Canada was willing to go to maintain its colonial order. The Mohawk were not seeking war. They were defending their ancestors' resting place. But by standing firm, they found themselves treated as enemies of the state. What had started as a simple barricade had now become a front line, and the world was about to see the true face of Indigenous resistance in Canada. The police raid and escalation. On the morning of July 11, 1990, after weeks of failed negotiations and mounting political pressure, the Quebec provincial government authorized the Sûreté du Québec to forcibly dismantle the barricades at Kanehsatake. The SQ operation was not a negotiation attempt. It was a tactical assault. Around 5:15 a.m., approximately 100 heavily armed officers approached the Mohawk barricade at the Pines. They were equipped with tear gas, concussion grenades, and military-grade weapons. Their objective was clear: break through the barricade, arrest those involved, and clear the land for construction to continue. The Mohawk community members were caught between fear and determination. Many of them were unarmed. Some had hunting rifles, traditional weapons, or whatever protection they could muster, not to launch an attack, but to defend themselves if necessary. The police launched tear gas grenades into the Mohawk positions. They deployed concussion grenades to disorient those at the barricades. Chaos quickly unfolded. Visibility disappeared in the clouds of tear gas. The sound of explosions and shouting filled the air. At some point during the confusion, gunfire was exchanged between the two sides. Reports differ as to who fired the first shot, and no clear conclusion has ever been firmly established. What is certain is that a bullet struck and killed Corporal Marcel Lemay, a 31-year-old SQ officer. His death immediately escalated the situation beyond a local police action. With the loss of a police officer, public outrage grew. Media coverage intensified. The Mohawk people were instantly portrayed in many outlets as dangerous militants, even though they had been defending their land from the beginning. The killing of an officer hardened the political response. Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa called for stronger measures. Within days, the provincial government requested military assistance from the federal government. The Canadian Army was mobilized under Operation Salon, the largest deployment of military forces against civilians on Canadian soil in recent history. More than 4,000 troops from units including the Royal 22 Regiment, armored units, engineers, and logistical support personnel were deployed to the region. The Canadian Armed Forces established multiple checkpoints, surrounded Kanehsatake, and prepared for siege operations. What had started as a peaceful blockade to protect a burial ground was now treated as a national security threat. And the Mohawk people, ordinary families, elders, women, and children, were now surrounded by military-grade weaponry. The deployment of soldiers did not lead to a peaceful resolution. Instead, it entrenched the standoff. The Mohawk were not willing to surrender, not after everything that had already been taken from them. Inside Kanehsatake, life grew harsher with each passing day. Food supplies dwindled. Access to medical care was cut off. Electricity and water were unreliable. Families lived under constant threat of a military assault. Outside the barricades, tensions among non-Indigenous residents escalated. Roads were blocked. Economic pressures built. Frustrations boiled over into open racism against Indigenous people, fueled by media narratives that framed the Mohawk as aggressors. But despite the immense pressure, the Mohawk people stood firm. Their message remained the same. They were not the ones who had escalated the situation. They were not the ones who had broken agreements. They were defending their land, their history, and their dignity. The government had chosen violence, and now the entire country and the world was watching. The standoff would continue for 78 days, becoming a test of endurance, spirit, and survival for the Mohawk community. But the events of July 11th made one thing brutally clear. Canada was willing to send soldiers against Indigenous people, not to protect peace, but to protect a golf course expansion. The question facing the country was no longer whether there was a land dispute. The question was, how far would Canada go to silence Indigenous resistance? The Canadian Army moves in. Siege of Kanehsatake. Following the death of Corporal Marcel Lemay during the failed police raid on July 11, 1990, the Quebec government requested military support to end the standoff at Kanehsatake. The federal government, under Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, authorized the deployment of the Canadian Armed Forces. The military operation was known as Operation Salon. It involved over 4,000 troops, making it one of the largest domestic military deployments in Canadian history outside of wartime. The soldiers deployed to Kanehsatake were not ordinary peacekeepers. They included armored units, engineers trained in breaching operations, snipers, and logistical support troops equipped with heavy machinery. The military established full control around the area. Barricades were reinforced with armored vehicles. Helicopters circled overhead. Snipers took up positions in the trees and on nearby buildings. Roads into and out of Kanehsatake were cut off. Supplies were blocked. The Mohawk people were completely surrounded. From the outside, the government's message was clear. This was not a negotiation. It was a siege. Inside the Mohawk barricades, conditions worsened by the day. Food supplies ran dangerously low. Water became scarce. Families rationed what little they had, uncertain when or if resupply would be possible. Medical care was almost non-existent. Sick elders and injured defenders had to make do with what little medicine and supplies remained inside the community. Constant surveillance by helicopters and drones ensured that there was no escape from the pressure. Psychological warfare also played a role. Loudspeakers blared propaganda toward the Mohawk barricades. At night, floodlights illuminated their camps to disrupt sleep and wear down their endurance. Despite this overwhelming show of force, the Mohawk people, including women, children, and the elderly, refused to abandon their position. They understood the stakes. The fight was not only for the Pines, it was for recognition of Indigenous rights that had been denied for centuries. The siege lasted through the heat of summer. Temperatures soared, tempers frayed. Families lived under constant fear of an all-out military assault. Throughout the 78 days of the standoff, rumors of impending attacks circulated almost daily inside the Mohawk camps. Each sunrise brought new uncertainty. Would today be the day the army moved in by force? International attention began to focus on the situation. Human rights organizations raised concerns. Foreign media outlets reported on the deployment of soldiers against Indigenous civilians. Still, the Canadian government maintained the stance that military intervention was necessary to restore order. Negotiations took place sporadically, but often broke down. The Mohawk insisted that land negotiations must take place before they would consider dismantling the barricades. The government, however, demanded an unconditional surrender. Inside the barricades, the Mohawk people lived in a permanent state of anxiety and vigilance. Mothers kept their children close. Young men and women took turns maintaining the defenses. But despite everything, morale remained strong. The Mohawk understood that surrendering now would mean abandoning not just the Pines, but the principle of Indigenous sovereignty itself. Even as soldiers surrounded them, even as the siege dragged into months, the Mohawk people stood. Their resilience during the siege of Kanehsatake became a symbol, not just of the defense of one small patch of forest, but of the broader Indigenous struggle across Canada for land, rights, and recognition. The standoff at Oka forced the entire country to confront a reality it had long tried to ignore: that Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples was still shaped by coercion, force, and denial. The Mohawk people had drawn a line at Kanehsatake, and even surrounded by tanks and rifles, they refused to cross it. Life behind the barricades, fear, hunger, and resistance. Life inside the Kanehsatake barricades during the Oka Crisis was defined by hardship, constant fear, and an unwavering sense of duty to the land. From July through September 1990, as the standoff dragged on for 78 days, daily existence for the Mohawk people became a test of endurance. The siege conditions were severe. Food supplies were quickly exhausted as access to stores and markets was cut off. What little food was brought in had to be rationed carefully among families, elders, children, and defenders. People survived on basics: canned goods, whatever local produce they could find, and occasional donated supplies that made it through. Medical supplies were critically low. There were no functioning clinics inside the barricades. Elders and those with chronic illnesses went without proper care. Pregnant women and sick children endured weeks without proper nutrition or medication. Clean drinking water became scarce as local infrastructure deteriorated under the blockade. The Mohawk people were forced to rely on rainwater collection, improvised wells, and limited river sources, often risking illness and dehydration. Electricity was unreliable. Communications with the outside world were limited. For much of the standoff, the Mohawk community was isolated both physically and politically. The psychological strain was immense. Military helicopters circled overhead daily, broadcasting the message that any movement was being watched. Snipers were visible in the treetops and hills surrounding Kanehsatake, their rifles trained on the community's defenders. Loudspeakers blared messages intended to wear down resistance, sometimes demanding surrender, other times broadcasting disinformation to create confusion inside the barricades. Families slept in shifts. At any moment, they feared an armed assault. Children, many too young to fully understand the politics behind the siege, learned to move quietly, to stay low to the ground, and to avoid windows. Mothers and fathers lived with the unbearable burden of not knowing if their children would be safe by morning. Despite these conditions, the Mohawk community organized itself. Rotations were established at barricades to ensure constant vigilance. Basic sanitation was maintained as best as possible in makeshift conditions. Community meetings were held regularly to update everyone on developments and to maintain collective morale. The Longhouse, the traditional Mohawk governing system, played a critical role in keeping the community focused and unified. From the outside, government officials and much of the media portrayed the Mohawk as aggressors holding the town hostage. Inside the barricades, however, the people knew the truth. They were defending sacred ground that the legal system had failed to protect. They were standing against generations of broken promises. They were enduring the same cycle of dispossession and marginalization that had defined their history since first contact with European settlers. There were moments of hope. Other Indigenous nations across Canada and even around the world sent messages of solidarity. Supply drives were organized by supporters. Some non-Indigenous allies attempted to break through blockades to deliver food and water. But the Mohawk knew they were largely alone. The longer the standoff continued, the more intense the outside pressure became. Public opinion shifted against them, fueled by media coverage that emphasized inconvenience to commuters and local businesses, rather than the systemic injustices faced by the Mohawk people. Still, they endured. Behind the barricades, life was not just about survival, it was about principle. The Mohawk people of Kanehsatake were defending more than a forest. They were defending the idea that Indigenous land, culture, and sovereignty still mattered, even when every system around them tried to erase it. By surviving the siege, they demonstrated to Canada and the world that Indigenous resistance would not quietly disappear, even under the weight of military occupation. They had drawn a line in the sand, and despite every hardship, they had not stepped back. Global attention, the girl with the eagle feather. As the Oka Crisis dragged on into August and September 1990, attention from both national and international media increased. What had begun as a local land dispute had now captured the eyes of the world. Images of armed soldiers facing Indigenous families spread across newspapers and television screens. For many Canadians, and for many people watching globally, the scenes were shocking. This was not the Canada they were familiar with. The country known for peacekeeping, multiculturalism, and human rights was now shown surrounding a small Indigenous community with tanks, assault rifles, and helicopters. Among all the images that emerged from the standoff, one stood out and became a lasting symbol of the crisis. The image of a young Mohawk girl facing a line of Canadian soldiers while holding an eagle feather. The girl was Wanique Horn Miller, a teenage Mohawk who had stayed inside Kanehsatake with her family throughout the siege. The photograph was taken during one of the most dangerous moments of the standoff, when Mohawk women and children were attempting to leave the community under military escort. It shows Wanique holding her younger sister tightly, her face a mixture of fear, defiance, and pain. In her hand, she holds an eagle feather, a sacred symbol in Indigenous culture representing strength, honor, and connection to the Creator. Moments before the photograph was taken, Wanique had been stabbed near the heart by a soldier's bayonet during the chaotic evacuation. Bleeding, traumatized, and in shock, she refused to drop the feather. The image became iconic. It showed the human cost of the crisis, not just in political terms, but in the physical and emotional trauma inflicted on Indigenous families. The eagle feather in Wanique's hand symbolized more than individual bravery. It represented the endurance of Indigenous identity under assault. It showed the determination of a people who refused to be erased even when facing military violence. International organizations, including human rights groups and Indigenous advocacy networks, used the image to call attention to the treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada. It undermined Canada's global reputation as a champion of human rights and exposed the hypocrisy of a nation that would send tanks against children defending their sacred land. In Canada, reactions were mixed. Some Canadians expressed outrage and demanded change. Others hardened their positions, blaming the Mohawk community for the disruption without understanding the centuries of history behind the conflict. For Indigenous peoples across the country, the photograph was a rallying cry. It reaffirmed the necessity of standing up for land rights, cultural survival, and dignity, even when the price was high. Wanique Horn-Miller survived her injuries. She would later become an advocate for Indigenous rights and a professional athlete, carrying the same strength and resilience she showed that day behind the barricades. The eagle feather she held remains a reminder that the Oka Crisis was never simply about a golf course. It was about survival, it was about sovereignty, and it was about the enduring spirit of Indigenous peoples who, generation after generation, refused to surrender their rightful place on their own land. The photograph of Wanique facing soldiers captured in a single moment what the entire Oka Crisis represented: a small, determined community standing against overwhelming force and refusing to be broken. The end of the standoff. By September 1990, after nearly 78 days of siege, the Oka Crisis moved toward an end. The living conditions inside Kanehsatake had deteriorated severely. Food supplies were nearly gone. Clean water was scarce. Medical care was practically non-existent. The community was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Outside the barricades, pressure on the Canadian government was also mounting. The cost of maintaining thousands of troops and the political fallout from the international attention made it increasingly difficult to sustain the military presence indefinitely. Negotiations resumed in earnest. Federal and provincial officials, military commanders, and Mohawk leaders began discussions aimed at ending the standoff peacefully. However, deep distrust remained. The Mohawk people had little reason to believe in the promises of governments that had ignored or betrayed them for centuries. In early September, a deal was finally brokered. The federal government agreed to purchase the disputed land from the town of Oka, effectively preventing the golf course expansion. In exchange, the Mohawk defenders were expected to dismantle the barricades and lay down their arms. On the surface, it seemed like a resolution. In reality, it was a fragile and temporary solution. The core issues, the recognition of Mohawk sovereignty over the land and a full settlement of their land claims, remained unresolved. The Mohawk community had successfully stopped the immediate destruction of the pines, but they had not achieved formal recognition of their ownership or rights over the territory. On September 26, 1990, the standoff officially ended. Mohawk Warriors and community members laid down their weapons. Some were arrested. Others were escorted away under military supervision. The scene was tense and painful. Families who had endured months of siege were now forced to walk past hostile crowds. And as they left, they faced yet another wave of hatred. Local civilians lined the roads. They shouted insults. They threw rocks at the departing Mohawk people, a final act of humiliation after months of resistance. Some soldiers tried to intervene, but many did not. The stone-throwing incident made it clear. The conflict was never only about land or barricades. It was about the deeply rooted racism that Indigenous peoples faced daily. A racism that erupted openly when they dared to stand up for their rights. The dismantling of the barricades did not bring closure. It brought new trauma. The Mohawk people of Kanehsatake returned to their homes, but nothing was the same. Their community was scarred by the violence, the siege, and the betrayal. Many carried physical injuries. Even more carried invisible wounds. The town of Oka continued to exist. The federal and provincial governments moved on to other political crises. But for the Mohawk, the memories of 1990, of the helicopters, the tanks, the rifles pointed at families, never faded. And most importantly, the land claims that had sparked the crisis remained unresolved for years afterward. The Oka Crisis ended in the tactical sense. The military withdrew, and the barricades came down. But the deeper crisis, the struggle for Indigenous rights, land recognition, and respect, did not end. In many ways, it was only just beginning. The events at Oka left a permanent mark on Canadian history. They forced Canadians to confront uncomfortable truths about their country's relationship with Indigenous peoples. And for the Indigenous nations across Canada, the Oka Crisis served as a reminder that standing for your land and your people often means facing violence, hatred, and sacrifice, even in so-called democratic societies. The fight for justice, recognition, and dignity continues long after the last barricade falls. The stone attack, society's racism exposed. One of the most revealing and disturbing moments of the Oka Crisis came not during the height of the standoff, but in its final days, when the Mohawk people were trying to leave the barricades peacefully. After enduring nearly 3 months of siege, facing military encirclement, food shortages, and relentless psychological pressure, the Mohawk defenders, along with women, elders, and children, began to evacuate Kanehsatake under military supervision. Most of the Mohawk families left in their own vehicles, private cars and trucks, while a few others, especially elders or those under arrest, were transported in military vehicles. The military was tasked with escorting the Mohawk convoys to ensure their safety. However, the protection offered was minimal. As the convoys passed through nearby towns, they encountered large crowds of angry civilians who had gathered along the roads. These civilians were not part of any official force. They were ordinary citizens, local residents, commuters, neighbors, many of whom had spent months absorbing media portrayals of the Mohawk as violent extremists or threats to public order. Fueled by fear, misinformation, and deep-seated prejudice, the crowds became violent. They hurled stones, rocks, and bottles at the Mohawk vehicles. Windows were smashed, cars were damaged, people inside the vehicles were injured. Children were struck by flying glass and debris. Elders who had survived the military siege were injured once again, this time by civilians who should have been their fellow citizens. Mothers tried to shield their children inside the cars as projectiles rained down. Military personnel, despite being present, did little to intervene effectively. Some soldiers attempted to hold back the crowds, but their efforts were limited and often passive. In many cases, soldiers stood by and watched the attacks unfold. The Mohawk people, already battered by months of siege and starvation, now faced the raw hatred of the public. This violence was not accidental. It was an expression of long-standing racism against Indigenous peoples, an attitude that had been encouraged and normalized by generations of colonial policy, land theft, and cultural erasure. The stone attacks made it clear. The Oka Crisis was never just about a land dispute. It was about the place of Indigenous peoples in Canadian society, a society that, when challenged, was willing to lash out violently against those who stood up for their rights. The attacks on the Mohawk were not condemned nationally with the urgency they deserved. There were few arrests. No major public inquiries were launched to investigate the behavior of the civilian attackers. The silence spoke volumes. For the Mohawk people, the message was undeniable. They were seen not as citizens defending sacred ground, but as enemies to be punished. The stoning of Mohawk families, particularly mothers, elders, and children, exposed the deep, systemic racism that shaped not just government policy, but everyday attitudes among Canadians. The end of the Oka Crisis was supposed to signal peace. Instead, it revealed how fragile Indigenous safety remained, even outside military siege. It showed that the real battle Indigenous people faced was not just with police or soldiers, but with a society that still did not see their humanity. And it made clear that reconciliation could not happen until Canada was willing to confront these ugly truths. The Mohawk did not simply defend their land during the Oka Crisis. They exposed the foundations of racism that continued to define Indigenous settler relations across the country. And that exposure remains one of the most important and most uncomfortable legacies of the Oka Crisis. Why the Oka Crisis still matters today? The Oka Crisis officially ended in September 1990, but its significance has never faded. More than 30 years later, the events at Kanehsatake continue to resonate across Canada and beyond. The Oka Crisis matters today because it exposed fundamental issues that remain unresolved: land rights, systemic racism, government accountability, and the ongoing struggle for Indigenous sovereignty. At its core, the crisis was never just about a golf course. It was about a pattern, a system, where Indigenous lands were routinely seized, sacred sites were desecrated, and Indigenous voices were ignored or silenced when they demanded justice. The Mohawk people stood against overwhelming force, police, military, media hostility, and public racism, simply to protect a burial ground that should never have been threatened in the first place. Their stand forced the Canadian public to confront realities that had long been hidden or denied. Before the Oka Crisis, many Canadians believed their country had a peaceful relationship with Indigenous peoples. The images from Kanehsatake, snipers in trees, tanks on suburban streets, stones thrown at Mohawk children, shattered that illusion. The crisis showed that Canada's colonial structures were still active, not relics of the past. Indigenous peoples were still treated as obstacles to development, rather than as rights-bearing nations. Today, the issues that fueled the Oka Crisis are still with us. Across Canada, Indigenous land claims remain unresolved. In British Columbia, in Ontario, in the Atlantic provinces, Indigenous nations continue to fight for recognition of their ancestral territories. Resource extraction projects, pipelines, and development plans frequently proceed without free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous communities, leading to new conflicts and standoffs. Systemic racism against Indigenous peoples persists in policing, healthcare, education, and the justice system. The high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in prisons, and the continued boil water advisories on many reserves reflect an ongoing failure to address these systemic injustices. The Oka Crisis also matters because it helped spark a new wave of Indigenous activism. Inspired by the Mohawk resistance, Indigenous youth and leaders across Canada became more politically active. Organizations grew stronger. Movements like Idle No More would later emerge, fueled by the spirit of resistance that Oka symbolized. The crisis also led to political changes, including the establishment of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in the 1990s, which produced a landmark report documenting systemic failures, although many of its recommendations were never fully implemented. For Indigenous communities, Oka remains a powerful memory of both trauma and resilience. It is a reminder of how quickly governments can resort to force when Indigenous peoples assert their rights, but also of how courage, unity, and determination can challenge even the most entrenched systems. For Canada as a whole, Oka is a test it has yet to pass. True reconciliation means addressing the causes of the Oka Crisis, not just commemorating it. It means recognizing Indigenous sovereignty. It means settling land claims with respect and urgency. It means ensuring that what happened at Kanehsatake never happens again. Remembering the Oka Crisis is not optional. It is essential for understanding where Canada stands today and where it must go if it truly seeks justice. Ignoring it, minimizing it, or relegating it to history books without action only ensures that similar conflicts will continue to erupt. The story of Oka is not finished. It is written every day that Indigenous peoples are forced to defend their land, their lives, and their dignity against the same forces that tried to silence them in 1990. Understanding the Oka Crisis is not about the past. It is about the present, and it is about building a different future. The Oka Crisis ended more than 30 years ago. The barricades have long been dismantled. The military convoys have left. The media attention has faded. But the real battle, the battle for land, for rights, for respect, continues. What happened at Kanehsatake in 1990 was not an isolated incident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not an accident. It was the result of centuries of colonization, dispossession, and systemic racism. The Mohawk people stood to defend a sacred piece of land, a burial ground that should never have been threatened. They stood peacefully. They stood with dignity. And they faced tanks, rifles, and helicopters in response. They endured a military siege. They faced starvation, violence, and isolation. And even after surrendering, even after enduring unimaginable hardships, they were met by crowds of civilians hurling stones at their cars as they left, cutting their faces, breaking their windows, and reminding them that in the eyes of many, they were still outsiders in their own homeland. The stones thrown at the Mohawk families in those final moments were perhaps the clearest symbol of the real problem. The Oka Crisis exposed not just government oppression, but societal hatred. It showed that Indigenous peoples in Canada were not just fighting policies, they were fighting an entire system of thought that saw them as less deserving of dignity, respect, or even basic humanity. The crisis forced Canada to look in the mirror. But looking is not the same as changing. Today, the same issues remain. Unsettled land claims, racial discrimination, forced resource extraction on Indigenous territories, and systemic inequalities. The courage of the Mohawk people at Oka should not be romanticized or reduced to a footnote. It should be a call to action. The Oka Crisis teaches us that silence is not neutral. Ignoring injustice only deepens it, and reconciliation without real change is just another broken promise. It reminds us that Indigenous sovereignty is not a threat. It is a right rooted in history, law, and basic human dignity. It reminds us that the fight for justice is not over, and it demands that we remember not just the barricades, not just the soldiers, not just the photographs, but the people. The mothers shielding their children from stones, the elders holding on to the memory of stolen lands, the young defenders who stood against armored vehicles with nothing but their convictions. Their courage lives on, their resistance lives on, and their struggle is not history, it is now. Until land rights are respected, until racism is dismantled, until Indigenous peoples are treated not as problems but as partners, the spirit of Oka will continue to speak. It is up to us whether we will finally listen. The Oka Crisis wasn't just about land. It was about survival, dignity, and resistance. The story didn't end in 1990. It's still being written today. Subscribe to History and Beyond and uncover the truths history books chose to forget. The Oka Crisis was not just a standoff, it was a mirror, a reflection of Canada's colonial past and the silence that still surrounds Indigenous pain. If we truly want reconciliation, we must start with remembrance. Share their story, speak their truth, and never let history be rewritten by silence.